This is Biology 101, Chapter 3, Water and Life. Okay, we're going to spend this entire chapter talking about water. And water is actually a very important molecule. We know that our bodies are made up largely of water. Water covers about 75% of the Earth's surface. And so this particular substance is prevalent, but is also, we see, one of the main reasons that we're able to sustain life on Earth at all. So when we look at water molecules, we're going to look at several properties of these of the substance to determine why it's so important. But if we think back to our examples from the last chapter, we see that water contains polar covalent bonds between the oxygen and hydrogens within a single water molecule. So if we look at the central water molecule in this figure, we see the oxygen and two attached hydrogens. Those bonds that are present there are polar covalent bonds, meaning that the electrons are shared, but they're shared unequally, which causes the hydrogens to take on a partial positive charge, which we can see here, and the oxygen takes on a partial negative charge. Because of this, that means that water is also able to form hydrogen bonds with other water molecules and other polar substances. And so we see that with this central water molecule, it's able to form hydrogen bonds with nearby water molecules where the hydrogens, with their partial positive charge, are attracted to oxygens nearby that have a partial negative charge, and vice versa. The oxygens of this water with partial negative charge are attracted to the hydrogens of waters nearby with partial positive charges. And so because of this, water has some very unique properties that we're going to talk about in this chapter and explore in a little bit of detail. So those four basic properties of water that we call the four life-supporting properties of water. So again, these are the things that makes water so important to life on Earth. Are first, cohesion and adhesion of water molecules, moderation of temperature by water, the fact that solid ice floats on liquid water, and this is related to the density of water, and then finally that water is the solvent of life. So all of these properties make water important to life on the planet, allows us to exist here on Earth, and we're going to explore each of these in a little bit more detail. So our first life-supporting property is cohesion and adhesion. And if you think about those words, I'm sure that you've heard them in some form before. You may have heard about a group of people being a very cohesive group, which means they work well together. Or you may have heard other substances called cohesive, meaning they tend to stick together. And so water, when we say that it is cohesive, it really means that water sort of sticks to other water molecules. And we know that it's those hydrogen bonds that causes it to do that, okay? So again, water has an attraction to itself because of those hydrogen bonds. Now, when we look at the term adhesion, you may think about adhesives, which, something like tape or glue is considered an adhesive, and it allows one thing to stick to another. And so adhesion of water means that water is kind of able to be attracted to or stick to other substances as well. And so when we look at water and this property, again, it's due in large part to the hydrogen bonds that water is able to form, not just with itself, but with other substances. And that's what causes the adhesion property. Now, this becomes very important in a variety of ways. In the example that we're showing here, we're looking at how water travels from the roots of a very large tree, because the roots are really where the water gets taken up. When it rains, water collects on the ground and soaks into the soil, and it's taken up by the roots of that tree, and then that water has to be transported all the way up through the trunk and out to the leaves of the tree at various heights. And so gravity is going to be working against water at every turn to prevent this from happening. So, it's a little puzzling if you're unfamiliar with the process about exactly what's happening. And what we see is that water is going to be moving through certain types of cells in the vascular tissue of the tree. And you can see their pictures here, water conducting cells. Now, these cells are going to be important in doing their job to actually move the water, but it's the properties of water itself that propel that process forward. So essentially what we see is that at the leaves, we're going to have photosynthesis taking place, and we're also going to have loss of water through the process of evaporation. And so any water that's present in the leaves of those trees is going to leave kind of, you can think of it as an empty space, okay? That empty space is going to be very quickly filled in by nearby water molecules, because water is always going to move from an area where there's a lot of it to an area where there's not so much of it. So we'll see that that water tends to diffuse or fill in that empty space. And because of the cohesive properties of water, it's going to pull other water molecules along with it. So the water, as it leaves this area at the leaves, okay, we see it leaving there, it's going to pull a chain of water, if you will, up through the trunk to fill in that space and to fill in the subsequent spaces that are vacated. Also, because of the adhesive properties of water, if we look at these cells, we see that because of the adhesive properties of water, the water molecules are able to be attracted to the cells themselves. And so that helps to minimize the pull or the effect of gravity, because the water is sticking to those cells as it moves up towards the leaves of the tree. And so this entire process is due to those two properties of water. We also see that because of the cohesive nature of water, water tends to have a very high surface tension. And so this really just refers to the ability to break the surface of a liquid. And the higher the surface tension, the harder it is to break the surface of that liquid. So we can see that there is, in the picture here, we see a water strider that's able to sit on the surface of water because of its small weight, but also because of the surface tension of the water, it's able to hold it up. Obviously, that wouldn't work for us, but if you've ever done a belly flop off of a diving board or something like that into a swimming pool, and you spread your surface area out and meet the surface of the water, you feel that surface tension. Whenever your body strikes the surface, it kind of stings, and that's because of that high surface tension. There's a lot of resistance against your body breaking the surface of that liquid, and you feel that resistance in the form of a stinging sensation. Okay, our second life-supporting property of water is that water is able to moderate temperatures. And what we really mean by this is that it's able to kind of keep temperatures mild because water has the ability to both absorb heat and release heat into the air. Now, what we mean by heat is that it's a measure of kinetic energy, okay? So it's kinetic energy means energy of movement, and so the faster your molecules are moving in a particular substance, the more heat there is contained in that substance. This should not be confused with temperature. These are actually two completely different measurements. Heat is a measure of the total kinetic energy, whereas temperature is a measure of the average kinetic energy. And so heat tends to be volume dependent, whereas temperature is volume independent. You can look at two very different volumes of liquid, and they can have the same temperature, but they're not going to have the same heat, because the larger volume will contain more kinetic energy because it has more molecules, and therefore it will have more heat. Now, what we see is that heat tends to move, again, from areas that are warmer to areas that are cooler. And we know this because if you were to take a cup of coffee, for example, and set it out on a cool day, that cup of coffee doesn't stay warm for very long. It takes just a little while for the heat to leave the coffee and go into the air. And so water is able to absorb and release heat in this way, and we're going to see the heat move from very warm areas to cool areas. So when we look at the summer months, what we see is that water is going to be constantly absorbing heat from the air because the air is warmer than the water, which has been cool all winter. And so the temperatures in areas where there's a lot of water will tend to be a little cooler than in areas where there's not as much water as you move inland. And we can see that in the diagram below, that along the coast of California, you might have temperatures in the 60s and 70s, but as you move further inland, you see that they increase up into the low 100s. So that big body of water there is able to absorb a great deal of heat from the air and bring those temperatures down to keep them mild. The opposite happens in the winter. when we now enter cooler months, and so the temperatures inland might be very, very cold. However, the water, which has been absorbing heat all summer, is now able to release some of that heat back to the air and raise those temperatures so that they tend to be a little milder, not quite as cold along the coast. And that moderation of temperature by water is due to its very high specific heat. So water is able to release and absorb a great deal of heat because it has a high specific heat. And this again is going to be due to those hydrogen bonds. All those hydrogen bonds that we see in water allow it to absorb so much heat. Now, we define specific heat as the amount of heat that must be absorbed or lost for 1 gram of the substance to change its temperature by 1 degree Celsius. And really, that specific definition is not terribly important for our purposes, but what we do need to know is that water has a high specific heat, which means that it takes a lot of heat in order to change its temperature significantly. This is why it takes so long to get water to boil, is because you have to actually add a great deal of heat to change the temperature enough to actually get to that boiling point. Now, a few other terms that we just need to cover. First, latent heat is going to be the heat that's released or absorbed during a change in state. And so changes in state refer to changes from gas, solid, or liquid to one or the other. And at any one of those changes, you're going to have to either absorb heat or release heat to produce that change. And so that would be considered the latent heat. Now, one of those changes in state is called evaporation, and this is where we see water or other substances go from the liquid form to the gaseous form. And this particular change in state is typically going to be driven by an absorption of heat to cause those molecules to move much faster so that they enter that gaseous state. We also see condensation occur where gas changes back to the liquid state. And we know that this happens very often, and typically that's going to be because of a loss of heat. So when you have a nice cold glass of iced tea in the summertime, we start to accumulate condensation very, very quickly on the outside of that glass because those molecules, those water molecules that are present in the air as water vapor, when they strike that cold surface of the glass, they then change back into the liquid form. And so that condensation is promoted by cooler temperatures. And so we see all of these things in the water cycle, which I'm sure that you've seen at some point in grade school. But the water cycle shows how water cycles through an ecosystem. And we know that water covers about 75% of the Earth's surface, and it's found in rivers and lakes and streams, but also in these very large oceans and seas that are present on the surface of the Earth. So all of that water is going to go through the process of evaporation at some point. Evaporation occurs without the addition of heat. However, heat does promote evaporation. Those water molecules that evaporate and become part of the air will eventually rise. And as the air rises, it reaches cooler temperatures, and those cooler temperatures will promote condensation of the gaseous form of water back to the liquid form. And then we get the formation of clouds. When those clouds get really, really heavy with liquid water, that water gets released in the form of precipitation, whether that's rain or snow. And that precipitation will then come back down to Earth and rejoin the water that's present here. So the water cycle is one of the ways that we see those properties of water kind of played out in a biological situation. Okay, our third life-supporting property of water is that a solid water, or ice, floats on liquid water. Now, this is important for several reasons, but one of the things that we need to consider is the reason that this occurs. Now, with most substances, as they get to their freezing point, the molecules become closer and closer and closer together, meaning that the substance becomes more dense. And when something is more dense, it will sink in a liquid. Ice or solid water does not do that. What happens is that as the substance cools, it does actually become more dense down to about 4 degrees Celsius. And at 4 degrees Celsius, water is as dense as it gets. And then from 4 degrees to 0 degrees Celsius, it starts to spread back out. And what we see is that at 0 degrees Celsius, when water actually freezes, it has created a very regular structure with a fair amount of space between the water molecules. So every water molecule will have a hydrogen bond with 4 other water molecules, and it creates a very regular structure, which you can see in the diagram below. Now, because of all that extra space, frozen water or ice is less dense than liquid water. And this allows several things to happen in a biological system. And here we're usually looking at ecosystems. So one of the benefits is that it allows for easier or faster thawing of lakes and small bodies of water. So the ice, because it is less dense, is always going to be at the surface of that body of water. This means that whenever we start to approach warmer temperatures, the ice is always going to be in contact with that warmer air, and that warmer air is what's going to cause the ice to thaw. If the ice was at the bottom, if it was more dense and it was at the bottom of the lake, then it would very rarely actually thaw, because it would take so much to get that water to a warm enough temperature that the ice would actually be allowed to thaw. So it would take a lot longer for that to occur. The other thing is that it allows life to exist below the ice in very deep water. And this is important because it means that these very deep lakes or deep bodies of water that do have ice on top don't completely die whenever a freeze occurs. The ice will trap those living things below, but there are still plenty of nutrients, and in a large body of water there should still be enough oxygen for those organisms to survive until the ice thaws and melts. The last thing is that this allows for turnover of lakes, and this really isn't due to the fact that ice floats on water. It's due more to the fact that water is most dense at 4 degrees Celsius. So what we see is that in the fall and in the spring, the top layers of water are going to approach 4 degrees Celsius. So if we were to look, for example, at the transition from summer to winter, we would see that the top layer of water goes from being a very warm temperature down to very cool temperatures. And when it reaches that 4 degrees Celsius mark, that water is now much heavier than all the water below it, and it sinks. And when it sinks, it pushes that top layer of water down, which pushes the bottom layer of water up, and it allows for a mixing of all the water that's in that ecosystem. This is good because the bottom layers of water are going to be very nutrient rich. The bottom layer of a lake is where all of the dead material sinks, and those dead materials, as they decompose and decay, will contribute nutrients back to that ecosystem. The top layers of water, because they are in contact with the air, are going to be very rich in oxygen. And so when we mix the lake twice a year, we see that it allows for the nutrient and oxygen content to remain very well mixed. The same thing happens in the transition from winter back to summer, except that we would be approaching that most dense water mark from the other direction. Okay, our last property of water is that it is the solvent of life. So we need to learn a few terms here. A solvent is going to be a dissolving agent, something that dissolves another substance. Solvents are going to be found in solutions, which is going to be a liquid that's a mixture of 2 or more substances. So the solvent is the substance in that solution that does the dissolving, and the solute is the substance that gets dissolved. So for example, in the diagram we see NaCl being dissolved in water. NaCl is table salt, so this is a very simple saltwater mixture. And what happens is the water molecules are able to surround the individual ions of the salt and actually dissolve them. So the water is the solvent and the salt is the solute. Okay. If we look at this picture more closely, I want for you to pay attention to the way that the water molecules will dissolve these substances. If you notice, the sodium, which carries a positive charge, is completely surrounded by water molecules such that the oxygens are facing the sodium in every single example. And the reason for this is because the oxygens because of those polar covalent bonds, have a partial negative charge. And that partial negative charge of the oxygens is going to be attracted to the positive charge of the sodium ion. Likewise, with the chlorine ion, the hydrogens of the water molecules that are surrounding the chlorine are all facing the chlorine ion here. And that's because those hydrogens carry a partial positive charge and are attracted to the negative charge on the chlorine. We call these hydration shells. Okay, so hydration means water. So it's essentially a shell of water that surrounds your ions. Now be careful and don't get that confused with a valence shell, which we discussed in chapter 2 as part of the structure of an atom. Okay, hydration shells simply refer to the way that water surrounds molecules in a solution. Now, water is a really great solvent because it's able to interact with so many different molecules or so many different substances because of those polar covalent bonds and partial charges and sometimes hydrogen bonds that it can form with these solutes. However, not all substances are going to dissolve in water. So those substances that do dissolve in water are called hydrophilic. Okay, which means that they have an affinity for water. They're water-loving substances. However, some substances don't dissolve in water, and we say that these are hydrophobic. They have no affinity for water, and hydrophobic literally breaks down to mean water-fearing. So it's important to understand the difference, and essentially what it comes down to is the types of bonds that are present in those substances. So oil, for example, we know doesn't mix with water. Whenever we try to mix them, the oil separates away from the water. And that's because oil is going to be a lipid, which is going to have primarily nonpolar covalent bonds. And if you remember, a nonpolar covalent bond means that the electrons are shared equally. And as a result, there are no charges on that molecule at all. Now with water has these partial charges. And so if it encounters something that has a positive charge, it puts the oxygens towards that positive charge. If it encounters something with a negative charge, it puts the hydrogens towards that negative charge. But when it encounters a substance that has no charge, it really doesn't know what to do with that substance, and so it tends to repel it or push it away. And we would say then that that substance is hydrophobic because it does not have the ability to interact with water. All right, we are going to finish up this chapter talking about acids, bases, and pH. I'm sure that everyone's familiar at some level with the pH scale. You've probably heard the words acidic in reference to maybe your digestive system or types of foods that you eat. And so we know a little bit about these terms already. But essentially what we need to understand is why something is acidic or why something is basic. And so if we start off just talking about pure water is what we call neutral, meaning that it's neither acidic nor basic. And on the pH scale, it's going to have a pH of 7. So what happens is that water has the ability to dissociate or break down into hydrogen ions, which we see here, H+, and hydroxide ions, which is an OH-. Now, if we look at this, these are ions because they have charges. So the OH has taken the electron from this hydrogen, which leaves the hydrogen positively charged. And that's how it's broken down. Now, typically that hydrogen ion is going to associate with another water to create a hydronium ion. But for our purposes right now, we're really just looking at the hydrogen ions themselves. Okay? So this reaction is going to happen back and forth all the time in pure water, but it happens at a fairly equal rate. The amount of hydrogen ions and hydroxide ions that accumulate are going to be equal, and so there's no significant change to the pH. However, if you have an acid and add that acid to your water, you're going to see a significant increase in the concentration of hydrogen ions, which we see here. Okay, hydrogen ions. Now, hydrogen ions are found at very high levels in acids, but found at very low levels in bases, because when a base gets added to water, it's actually going to accept those hydrogen ions or absorb those hydrogen ions, or possibly the base creates hydroxide ions that are able to combine with the hydrogen ions to make water. So essentially what we're looking at is an acid is going to have a high concentration of hydrogen ions, and bases have a low concentration of hydrogen ions. When we look at this on the pH scale, though, it gets a little bit confusing, because acids have a lot of hydrogen ions but have a low pH. So from 0 to just below 7 on the pH scale is going to be acidic. Bases have a low hydrogen ion concentration but a high pH. So just above 7 all the way up to 14 is going to be considered basic. A couple of things to note about the pH scale is that when we actually look at this change in pH from 7 to 6 and 6 to 5, this is a logarithmic scale. So from 7 to 6 is a 10 to the first change in the concentration of hydrogen ions. So it's a tenfold change. But from 7 to 5, it's a 10 to the second change in the concentration of hydrogen ions, which would be a 100-fold change. And so as we start looking at differences in pH, it's important to realize that difference of pH from 2 to 7 is not just a 5-fold difference, but it is a hugely significant difference in the concentration of hydrogen ions. The other thing is that it's interesting to note the types of things that fall into the acid and base categories. So we know that citrus fruits and sodas and things like that are acidic. If you start looking at things of biological significance, they're going to be very close to 7. So urine and saliva are mildly acidic, whereas human blood, tears, and the inside of your small intestine are mildly basic. The reason that those things are going to be fairly close to 7 is because in your body, there has to be a fairly narrow pH range in order for all of these molecules to function properly. And this is one of those things that we'll address when we start chapter 5 a little bit later on. We also see milk of magnesia, which you may or may not be familiar with. This is actually an antacid that you would take if you had an upset stomach. And upset stomachs are caused by the formation of too much acid in your stomach. And so when you add milk of magnesia, which is basic, it helps to absorb those hydrogen ions to bring the pH back to a somewhat normal range that you can tolerate to get rid of that indigestion. All right, the last thing, or one of the last things that we're going to talk about in terms of acids and bases is buffers. Buffers are going to be substances that resist or minimize changes in pH and are very important in biological systems. And essentially in a buffer, you have a weak acid and a weak base that will adjust the hydrogen ion concentration as needed depending on changes that occur. So blood is actually a great buffer. It contains carbonic acid and a bicarbonate ion. So whenever our solution is too basic, we see the reaction proceed this way, where the carbonic acid donates hydrogen ions to bring the pH back to a slightly more acidic state. And when the solution becomes too acidic, we see the reaction go in the reverse direction, where the bicarbonate ion absorbs hydrogen ions to bring it back to a slightly more basic situation. And so those buffers work to kind of minimize those changes in pH and keep them within a very narrow range. And then finally, looking at the ecological significance of pH, we've kind of looked to see about what happens in a human body and in living things, but there are implications for pH at the ecological level as well. And one of those is that, I'm sure that you've heard the word fossil fuel in the news and things like that. We burn fossil fuels all the time in order to produce our energy. And the fossil fuels that we burn add carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. Now, the carbon dioxide that we add to the atmosphere contributes to global warming because it is a greenhouse gas, and we'll talk about that in Module 6. But one of the other things that can happen is that carbon dioxide can be absorbed into aquatic ecosystems. And when it gets absorbed into these aquatic ecosystems and is joined up with water molecules, it actually becomes acidic and forms acids. Okay? And so it can lead to ocean acidification, which is naturally going to be bad for the organisms that live there. But it can also lead to the production of acid rain or acid precipitation, because that water could be absorbed and then condensed through the process of the water cycle to create precipitation. And so it's really important for us to kind of pay attention to the effects that we have on our environment, because there are definitely unintended consequences that can occur as a result of our daily activities. So that's it for Chapter 3 in our discussion of water. Up next, we'll be looking at carbon and the biological molecules that we see in all living things.